Okay, guys, good morning. So this week we're going to talk about state capitalism and international dependency. So I'm actually building on the first week's lecture when we talked about like the colonial capitalism and the role of the colonial authority in developing like the responsibility of authority for economic or underdevelopment in the region, and we investigated different cases in order to understand the varieties of the colonial authority. So the point this week is to bring back, the agency of the post-colonial elites into the analysis in order to investigate to what extent they built upon, the heritage of the colonial authority in terms of formulating economic and developmental policies, and to what extent we can proportionate the blame, what kind of policies they formulated and what kind of actions they took in order to push through industrialization projects or to expand industrialization bases or policies, and to what extent this post-colonial elites would be responsible for poor records of economic and social developments in the region. So I'm going to start out. I'm basically pushing or pivoting the focus away from international dependency. This is very simplistic notion about the positionality of the Middle Eastern countries in the world economy, and I'm going to talk about to what extent why post-colonial elite didn't manage to formulate or to establish a developmental state with a strong institutional basis in order to push through big industrialization policies, and would be responsible for technological upgrading, as it's the case in East Asia and newly industrialized nations. So the whole point here, why some states in the global south, or why some state intervention would be beneficial and useful for economic growth and economic progress, and why state intervention in the Middle East, as the case under investigation here, would be responsible for economic underdevelopment. So here we are going to focus on the institutional capacity of the state and the quality of the state intervention in the Middle East, after investigating what do we mean by developmental state, and why some countries in the global south managed and the global periphery managed, to push through good records of economic progress and industrialization policies. And here we're going to talk about the institutional capacity of the post-colonial state in the Middle East, and to what extent they managed to accumulate efforts for capital formation and capital accumulation, with a specific focus on Egypt and Syria. These are the most prominent cases, and we're going to investigate further in the seminar discussion. And this is how I'm going to pave the way for next week's topic about neoliberalism, and how the failure or the exhaustion of import substitution, industrialization, or state capitalism in the Middle East ran into trouble, how the policies ran into trouble and led to financial crisis, and obliged and forced political elites to implement austerity measures and neoliberal economic policies or economic reforms. So if I ask you why some states, or why some forms of state intervention would be beneficial for economic growth while others not. So what are the key variables here? Why Taiwan and South Korea, for example, managed, to implement successful state interventionist policies in terms of industrialization policies or in the industrial transformation and technological upgrading, and why we don't have newly industrialized nations or countries in the Middle East.
Economic policy, like some article states some countries
So the orientation of political elites. Okay, so when we talk about like patterns of state intervention, so we focus on two main pillars or two main aspects. The first one is like the formulation of the choices of the policy, like what kind of policies political leaders or state, decided to formulate, and the capacity of the implementation. Because like smart policies, they don't, or good policies, they don't implement themselves. They need institutional capacity in order to be implemented efficiently. So we talk about two dimensions here. The first one is the policy formulation, the choices, the policy choices, and the capacity of the implementation. Okay, so when it comes to the policy choices, in order to achieve high rate of economic progress or economic good records of remarkable records of economic prosperity. So what kind of policy choices political leadership would implement in order, or would choose to, in order to achieve high rate of economic growth. So first thing is like here I'm not neglecting, the social dimension or the social justice aspect of developmental policies, but here in order to achieve high rate of economic progress, the state, has to choose some kind of policies that would enable these kind of industrial transformation and the quality of the products in order to channel resources or to direct private capital towards the leading sectors that would have trickle-down effect and would meet the goals of industrial transformation and technological upgrading in order to lead, to transform the whole economic structure from import substitution industrialization to export-led economic growth or economic policies. So the state, in order to meet these goals, so the state has to have some sort of consultation and coordination with the business people, with the business groups, and at the same time, it has to discipline labor. So it has to make sure that there's enough supply of cheap labor for the private capital in order to implement these ambitious industrialization projects or rapidly expansionist industrial policies. So the state has to choose like some sort of policies in order to ensure, the support of investors in order to accumulate enough capital. What kind of policies, political leadership may choose in order to encourage and support private capital? Protective tariffs, for example, they need to offer them, to shield them from international competition, so it imposes some sort of protective tariffs on imports in order to stimulate domestic demands for manufacturing goods or finishing products. They offer them some sort of subsidies, they offer them some sort of raw materials and like surpluses of the operation of the state itself, and in order to encourage them to change the orientation towards international market, it may give them some sort of export subsidies as well in order to encourage them to produce for the international, to enhance to improve the quality and to enter the international market. The state, may control, or like the state has to control the access to credit, like it has to have control over the banking sector in order to facilitate loans or access to credit to preferable investors or private capital. And then it may encourage, they invest in R&D agencies or research projects in order to inform them about the international standards, the advances of technology on the international level, and to promote, these technological upgrading, and at the same time to discipline labor force. So these are like some sort of like supporting private capital and cultivate some sort of collaborative and cooperative relationship with the private investors in order to enable this. So when it comes to policy formulations, it has like supply side and demand side. For the supply side, in order to make sure that there is enough supply of capital in order to stimulate capital accumulation and capital formation. So private business or the private capital, domestic capitalists are the main like drivers, for a capital accumulation and capital formation. So with this regard, so it has, like, the state may opt for preferable or easy taxation system. It offers them some sort of privileges when it comes to tax holidays and labor repression in order to undermine their bargaining position vis-a-vis or in relation to the employers. The state may channel some like allocate budget for building infrastructure. So these kind of projects are essential for private capital to establish their enterprises or to run their enterprises, and they would refrain from investing money into these projects because of the high risk and the low returns also. So the state may take the lead to invest in public projects or public building infrastructures in order to enable them to operate or to establish their enterprises, and to offer them some sort of strategic grants, like it may like reward performers by offering them some sort of economic privileges like access to credit, as I mentioned, and to discipline the workers. And the demand side, like on the demand side, in order to make sure that there is like a sustainability when it comes to this collaborative relationship with the private capital. So the state may institutionalize or has to institutionalize the relations with the private business. Like it has to have like organizational foundation, like, you know, some bureaucratic agencies that would embed the private interest and would enable them, offering them some sort of research or studies that these are the leading source, the leading sectors you may like channel or put your money, invest your money into these sectors. That this would enable like private capital to accumulate benefits and to invest more in the national and international market. Active fiscal policies as well, like in order to stimulate demand, so this low interest rate would encourage, you know, consumers to purchase finished or domestic goods. This would stimulate demands, domestic demands for their products, and would increase their productivity and keep the wheel running as well. Export promotion, as I mentioned, by encouraging them by offering some sort of subsidies in order to encourage them to export, to produce products for the international markets and to improve their competitiveness position on the international market. So when it comes to fiscal policies, the bureaucratic, like the organization or the institutionalization of the relationship with the private capital, these are very essential in order to secure or to sustain, you know, these kind of collaborative relationship with the private capital, and to stimulate, to foster, stimulate demands and to foster economic growth and economic expansion. So the outcome, the economic outcome that would emerge, you know, from this is like capital accumulation. These people would accumulate, like private capital or private business people would accumulate capital and would invest more and expand more in industrial sectors. The state as well, like should have like these kind of institutional and organizational foundation that would enable political leadership or the bureaucrats to have these ambitious linkage strategy in order to direct and to offer, you know, some sort of direction and orientation to the private capital. So the state must have the capacity, or the bureaucratic and the organizational capacity, to have these ambitious linkage strategy between like suppliers and producers, the downstream and upstream sectors, in order to enable them to expand their to increase their productivity and to invest more in human resources. And in order to mitigate any risk from coming from popular unrest or popular labor uprisings or labor strikes, the state must invest in human resources as well, in education, technical training, and technical and vocational training, and this would benefit both sides. The private enterprises, that they will have like trained workforce in order to increase the productivity, and the workforce as well, like the labor or workers themselves would be like qualified enough in order to join the industrial sector and would cope up with the technological upgrading and industrial expansion. So these are when it comes to the policies that would enable like state in order to sustain high rate of economic growth and transform the economic structure from agricultural export basis towards industrial orientation or industrial policies. But as I mentioned, the implementation as well is very essential because like the state, like the bureaucratic apparatuses must have the capacity or in order to apply or to implement these policies efficiently. So do you think like regime type is essential here? Like democratic countries might have like, or like the democratic regimes might be capable, much more capable than authoritarian regimes in order to implement these policies efficiently? You're sleepy? Oh, okay. I mean, like, in order to have, like, you know, what kind of, like, the role, we are talking about the role of the state in stimulating economic growth and sustaining and fostering economic prosperity and transforming the economic structure, okay? So we talk about, like, state capitalism and the quality of the state intervention in the economy. So we talked about like two dimensions here, policy formulation on the supply side and demand side, and in order to guarantee this enough supply of capital and the processes of capital accumulation, so the state has to develop, to cultivate some sort of consultative mechanisms and cooperative mechanisms with the private capital or domestic entrepreneurs. But this is like the policy formulation side. Like when it comes, like they might have like these kind of policies, like active fiscal policy, investment in human resources, pilot agency or pilot research in order to direct and orient private capitalists towards certain sectors that might have the leading effect or the trickle-down effect on the whole economy. But the state must have the capacity in order, the state apparatuses or the bureaucratic apparatuses must have the capacity in order to implement these policies efficiently. The fiscal, active fiscal policies and these kind of sustainable cooperative mechanisms with the private capital and having control over labor. So the regime type has something to do with the capacity, the institutional capacity. Definitely what?
Rather than sort of the maturity. So in that way, the fiscal policies of the government is favoring the class circle of the people.
So you guys agree that like regime type plays like important role, or it has something to do, it's an important variable? So it's totally the opposite way around. Like the developmental state is authoritarian, because I'm talking about like East Asian countries. Okay, so the literature like that makes a link between development and democracy is inconclusive, because for example, I'm building on Kahli's work. He compared between like different countries in authoritarian and democratic countries, and he mentioned that in democratic countries like India, for example, and Brazil, the politicization of the formulation of economic policies, these kind of politicization, the history of the politicization and the fragmentation between different social sectors, it affected, the quality of the state intervention, because the state and even the introduction of democratic policies and party politics, so they have to reconcile different interests. So the state didn't have this kind of tight control over market actors in order to develop these kind of agencies and organizational foundations that enabled the developmental state in East Asia and the some newly industrialized nations in order to implement these developmental policies. So what's the central element here, or the core feature of developmental state, is the institutional character of the state, the organization of the authority, whether or not in Weberian sense, whether or not they have these kind of rational, legal, bureaucratic apparatus, or it has this kind of patrimonial structure. So the state, obviously, the organization and these kind of deployment of political authority is very essential, and is a crucial or is like a stepping stone towards implementing efficient developmental policies. And efficient bureaucrats as well, the bureaucrats, they have to be insulated from any kind of pressures coming from private business or the private capital, in order to reward performers and to penalize or to exclude those who don't abide by the state, the framework of the developmental policies. So bureaucrats, they have to enjoy some degree of autonomy towards private capital in order to distribute, these strategic rents, and to offer these economic privileges to them, not to be under the pressure of the private business or the private capital. So Kahli here distinguished between developmental states as it emerged in South Korea versus intermediate state that emerged in Brazil and India, and fragmented multi-class or patrimonial state as it happened in Nigeria, and in most cases some sub-Saharan Africa. So the whole point here is you need to investigate or to look at the bureaucratic apparatus, to what extent the political authority is centralized and cohesive enough in order to implement these far-reaching or ambitious developmental policies, and to what extent the relationship between bureaucrats, or to what extent what kind of the degree of autonomy of the bureaucrats in relation to the private business, in order to build these consultative mechanisms, and to reach this agreement in order to discipline and to repress labor force, and to guarantee this accumulation of profits, to channel their money into the sectors the state actually directed them towards, in order to accumulate benefits and then to upgrade their operations or enterprises, in order to guarantee these technological upgrading and export-led industrialization or export-led growth. So can you guess what, to put it briefly or in concisely, so what developmental state is? That might have this capacity in order to implement these ambitious industrialization policies. So this is so mainly, as I mentioned, it's basically the institutional feature or the organizational apparatuses of the state. This is what you need to look at. To what extent it's the political authority is organized, and to what extent they have bureaucrats, they have degree of autonomy in order to formulate these policies and to implement these policies and to direct the private business towards. So there is kind of collaboration between private and public sectors. So there is no like hostility or animosity between the state and the private capital, and they can reward performance and and distribute some sort of grants, to like potential spoilers as well, in order to reach the goal that they can produce products and to expand their industrial basis in order to be competitive enough in the international market. So these institutional arrangements give bureaucrats the political clout to make credible but conditional commitments, and thus to withdraw support from firms that underperform in spite of state assistance. So they have to monitor performance in order to keep rewarding or withdraw benefits from underperformers. So solving what's the essential point here? These institutions offer a solution to the commitment problem. So like in order to get access to credit, in order to have like these kind of economic privileges or economic facilities, so you have to accumulate, benefits and to work in these sectors. It happened like in textile and electronics. They started out, with these sectors, and then they shifted, from these sectors to heavy or capital-intensive industries in East Asia or in the developmental state in East Asia and in newly industrialized nations. So these kind of institutions are autonomous enough, and they have like the organizational capacity in order to coordinate efforts and to solve the information to disseminate information. So this would offer private capital, or provide them with enough information about, the leading sectors, about the status of the international competition, about the advancements in technological sectors. They can mediate the negotiation between domestic capital and foreign firms in order to transfer technology, or to have like some sort of contract between them. So these kind of organizational and far-reaching organizational apparatuses is streamlined under cohesive bureaucratic and national apparatus is very essential to coordinate effort and to pursue long-term economic objectives. Okay? So why developmental states are scarce? Why it's rare to find, many developmental states? Like what? Yeah, because the whole point here, the state in the global south, it has to play important role in economy given the scarcity of the capital. So the state, it might be like one essential source to form, capital and accumulate capital by investing, in public infrastructure and transferring surpluses to the private sector in order to mitigate private risk. So given like technological backwardness and fragmented or rigid the structure of the labor market. So the state in the global south, like given the historical development and given the capacity of the market players, it has to intervene. But what would enable what enabled the historically developmental state to emerge in East Asia? Any guess on this? Yeah, in South Korea, for example, what enabled? This is one explanation that, like, I'm referring to one article that actually refuted.
It's a trend that if you look at these states, they are only like coastal cities, mostly rural ones.
Yeah, Donner, Ricci, and Slatter, for example, they argued against, this kind of the colonial legacy. What they said, like, you need to understand the motivation and the political origins of this. Some studies mentioned something about the legacy of the colonial power, like the Japanese colonial authority, they left behind far-reaching and good like institutional foundation for South Korea, for the leadership in South Korea, in order to build upon, in order to invest more, to invest into these far-reaching organizational and bureaucratic apparatuses. But this is the case like in South Korea, but in Singapore, for example, like the British colonial authority, they left behind, or they left a different legacy. And in Philippines, that like this country, like Singapore is one of the newly industrialized country, and Philippines, they managed, they made like, great stride in diversifying, their economy, and they actually dismantled, the heritage or the legacy of the American colonialism, and they managed to create or to establish some sort of effective or efficient enclaves in the bureaucratic apparatus. So they actually refuted this because perhaps it would be applicable, or it would apply to one country, but not to not to be applicable to other developmental states. Other investigations as well, they focus on during these formative periods, like these states relied heavily on the domestic capital rather than they cultivated, this kind of collaborative relationship with the private capital rather than foreign capital, in order to mitigate, any risk of independency on the international or foreign players. But that was the case in South Korea and Taiwan only, and it's not applicable to Singapore, for example. And like other explanations focus on ethnic homogeneity, but as well, like, perhaps like some countries like South Korea, ethnically homogeneous, but in Singapore, for example, like they have like some sort of or degree of social and ethnic heterogeneity. So what they mentioned here, they talk about like, we need to push the needle or to nudge it like away from this kind of what they call thin politics, in order to understand what kind of political choices historically had been made in order to face what they call systemic vulnerability. Systemic vulnerability, in their definition, they talked about these states faced like existential threat, not only like the survival of political regimes, but the state itself faced external threats that obliged and forced political leadership to make decisions to have like this kind of ambitious project of state building by investing more and more into the building extensive organizational and high capacity and organizational foundation of the developmental state. So they talk about like three main factors, and you need to understand to what extent political leadership made decisions with regard to this constellation of conditions that made these states vulnerable to external threat, internal and external threat. So basically the broad coalition commitments. So the first thing, like they had the minimum winning coalition was not an attractive option for these states. So the state had to include popular sectors like labor as well, because they couldn't afford any kind of social unrest during that period. But the thing is, they did make side payments. They did like, like if you remember, we talked about like, no, that was in Latin American courses, like the popular incorporation. So political leadership might include or incorporate popular sectors in order to offer them electoral support, in order to use them against political opponents or in their political contestation. But the thing here, they did that in a more efficient way and for economic reason. So instead of like, giving them or doling out material benefits, they did like some sort of more efficient economic payments in terms of like joint ownership or joint production. So in this way, they would increase the productivity farmers, for example, in order to export, more agricultural products, and at the same time, they offer them some sort of training and educational opportunities that would benefit the whole or economic or the entire economic structure later. So they made like efficient or less costly side payments for the popular sector in order to not to deteriorate their living conditions, and at the same time this would be like a long-term investment in the economic structure as a whole. They faced security threat and external wars or external threat, mainly this made like, accelerating or the rate of economic growth was very essential for them in order to offer for them to buy arms and to offer some sort of support for the military operation that would benefit them or enhance their position against their international or external enemies. So the war actually obliged them to find some sort of resources in order to generate revenues, in order to exist, in order to preserve the existence of the state, and to keep financing, the military. Scarce resource endowment. So these people, or these states, they didn't have oil, for example, or any natural resources or easy money to count or to rely on. So they had no other options or no other choices left but to invest into, these organizational apparatuses and to cultivate, these supportive and collaborative relationships with the domestic capital in order to transform the economy from agricultural based economy to export or industrial based with high quality export products. And this enabled them to make technological upgrading as well, because industrial transformation in the economic diversification and technological upgrading, these are essential components for any economy to sustain and to stimulate growth and to sustain these kind of economic progress. So these together, these conditions together, obliged and forced political leadership in East Asia and in East Asia mainly to invest or to in establishing development state, or to have this ambitious project of state building project. So these kind of coalitional, geopolitical and fiscal constraints, these were necessary conditions that enabled or pushed political leadership to make these choices, policy choices, with regard to industrial and developmental policy formulation. So these are the necessary condition, and the leadership choices were in their account were kind of secondary. They dealt this as a secondary variable rather than a necessary variable. So now we are going to examine to what extent this account would be applicable to, here the coalitional, the geopolitical and the fiscal constraints. Okay, so these made these factors or these constellation of conditions made up these kind of systemic vulnerability context that actually enabled the emergence of the developmental state. What extent these factors were present in the Middle East on the during the period of the state building. So here, as I mentioned, so what they said, because this is what happened in the Middle East as well. So they started out with import substitution industrialization. They crafted, this kind of extensive policies. They channeled resources, to the agricultural sector in order to increase the agricultural products or agricultural exports, and they imposed some restrictions on imports and increased government expenditure, but in training and in education, in order to increase the productivity of the farmers. And in the second stage, they had to invest money into the export promotion because of the fiscal constraint. They didn't have enough resource endowment to rely on or to count on. So that's why they had to invest in bureaucratic centralization. So they had to streamline all the bureaucratic agencies and to put them under one overarching or organizational umbrella in order to coordinate efforts with the private sector and to make this kind of ambitious linkage strategy between downstream upstream suppliers and downstream producers, and then industrial deepening and upgrading in order to make this kind of expansionist policies in human resources and training and in technological upgrading as well. So what happened in the Middle East, and this is what we are going to investigate further in the seminar. So like this kind of the ideological force of pan-Arabism in during that actually gained the momentum after Nasser took over power in Egypt. So this actually enabled political leadership in the region in order to implement these far-reaching import substitution industrialization. So they tried to replicate the model, the Turkish experience of import substitution industrialization after the disintegration of the empire and Ataturk project of political and economic modernization there. So Egypt actually started out with this ambitious plan in order to accelerate, to stimulate economic growth they had like this like slogan from needle to rocket, and during this period they had like still had some sort of collaborative relationship with the private sector. So the private sector had a share in industrial investment during this plan, and then but after let me not here, but the thing is after the import substitution industrialization ran into trouble, and they had because of the second one. So what happened? It was like the June defeat in 1967, and they were unable, to proceed with the strategy. And the successor Anwar Sadat had to implement austerity and economic opening or economic liberalization measures in order to balance the book or to deal with the balance of payment deficit. In Algeria, so this is like an overarching view about the failure of the import substitution industrialization across the region. So in Algeria as well, after a short period of self-management under Ben Bella, and then Boumediene took over power, and he formulated the first 4-year plan, and they had again this slogan of industrialization first, and they invested into industrialization or rapidly industrialization projects, but they ended up having fiscal constraints and fiscal crisis because they neglected the agricultural sector, and they had they relied more on the food imports, and they ended up having the food crisis, and they had to open and liberalize the economy as well. In Tunisia, they didn't have this domestic entrepreneurial bourgeoisie, and they implemented the 4-year plan, but again the excessive borrowing, international borrowing, and the excessive imbalances between imports and exports, it pushed political elites to implement market reform measures quite earlier than other countries in 1969 in order to stimulate private sector, and this actually with the support of the European Commission back then. Syria as well, it had domestic, so in different following the same logic of the exhaustion of the import substitution industrialization and the failure of the state capitalism model, but in different timing, all populist republics that once implemented import substitution industrialization had to open up the economy and to implement neoliberal reform measures. In Syria, it was quite different because they had domestic class of landowners and merchants, as we are going to discuss in the seminar, but the fierce struggle between the political authority and these economic forces or economic actors led eventually, it actually delayed, enabled the Ba'ath Party to have iron grip on power, but at the same time, it enabled them to have a short period of infitah in a different meaning, as we are going to discuss. Infitah meaning giving the state more or much space in the economy, but Syria actually was isolated from the global market. So this enabled the Ba'athist elites in order to stall the implementation of economic reform measures until late 80s and early 90s. What enabled them, it was like, they have like, oil in some regions, so they had like, so they offer some sort of oil concessions, and the intervention in Lebanon, the Lebanese war offered them like another market, and it did encourage, the tourist sector in Syria, because like foreigners or tourists that would have like visited Lebanon during the war, they shifted, their plan towards Syria. So this gave the oil and the intervention in Lebanon, or the civil war in Lebanon, gave like a breathing space for political leadership in Syria to stall the implementation of the economic reform measures. But in total, these countries failed to implement, failed to transform the economic structure from agriculture-based economy to industrial upgrading and technological upgrading as well. One of the main interpretation was mainly like placed the blame on the absence of domestic bourgeoisie, or the lack of domestic entrepreneurial class, as it happened, in East Asia. But actually, this concealed, some sort of conflicts and some sort of conflictual dynamics that accompanied or coincided with the processes of the state building, as it was very clear in Syria. So, like, they have, like, this kind of domestic, like, capitalist or private capital, but the state developed this kind of hostility, or tended to deliberately dismantle, these kind of entrepreneurial class. With the socialist transformation in Egypt, and and Syria, and Algeria as well. So they tried, to dismantle or to destroy, this kind of what existed, after the departure of the colonial authority from the old bourgeoisie, that often conflicted, like the logic of the state building actually conflicted with the logic of the capital formation and capital accumulation. So the state in order, or the post-colonial elites, in order to maintain their grip on power, so they had to crack down on the domestic entrepreneurs, or domestic bourgeoisie, in order to eliminate any source of threat. So here, like, regarding the three elements of the systemic vulnerability, like, can you the coalitional one, the geopolitical, and the resource endowment, can you apply this to the case of Egypt and Syria? Like, coalitional politics, they had to expand, the minimum winning coalition was not an option in order to dismantle or to enhance their political position in the face of old bourgeoisie or old enemies. So they had like to expand, their support base among popular classes. But the thing is, they made like inefficient economic side payments. They politicized this kind of side payment without any vision that this would feed back into the economic progress or economic development or not. Geopolitical, like external wars and geopolitical concerns, like they had like a war with Israel as well, so they faced some sort of existential threat, but it didn't actually push political leadership to expand more or to invest more into the organizational capacity of the state, or to deepen industrialization, or to upgrade, the economy. With regard to resource endowment, these countries, except for Syria, they are not like, they are poor countries when it comes to resource endowment. But the thing is, the crucial thing is here was the massive influx of foreign support or foreign aid. So the easy money that came from the Gulf and other countries pushed political leadership to make these kind of easy choices. So the thing is, like, the state building conflicted with the the demands for capitalist or exigencies of capitalist development or capitalist growth. So here they politicized the appointment in the bureaucratic apparatuses in order to have like loyals in the bureaucratic apparatus, regardless of their previous experiences or expertise. So the all positions, they were not like open for competition, and they were not like, meritocratic. There were no meritocratic standards in order to appoint these bureaucrats. So they had no experience, in running public affairs, and they had actually the rapid turnover as well. It prevented the accumulation of the bureaucratic experiences that would have enabled them to make efficient or enhance to make efficient choices and to enhance their implementation capacity. Dismantling domestic bourgeoisie as well, they didn't have any kind of consultation with the domestic class or the domestic capital. Nasser, for example, he had like, this kind of brutal nationalization and asset confiscation policies, and it actually got worse or aggravated after the socialist transformation in 1961. Al-Assad and Ba'athist forces in Syria, they cracked down on the national bourgeoisie, especially after the coup, after the end of the unification experiment with Egypt. So the coup actually it enabled domestic bourgeoisie to gain some sort of power, and this actually pushed Ba'athist elites to harshly crack down on them or to dismantle them for fear of gaining or accumulating enough power that would be threatening for their political position in the future. Inefficient side payments for popular incorporation, just like, doling out material benefits rather than having joint ownership or joint production, or having some sort of a clear plan in investing in training programs and in agricultural sectors, that ended up with a shortage of foreign capital because they relied on imports of machines and equipments in order to support or to finance the industrial sector, and this actually led to decreasing productivity, lack of training, decreased the productivity of the labor, and decreased and pushed down the wage rate as well. So they didn't have any kind of national saving in order to invest more in the economy, and they didn't have the purchasing power in order to stimulate or to absorb the domestic products. And actually they didn't have any sort of orientation towards encouraging exports. So they didn't have enough, the domestic market was unable to absorb the products or the manufactured goods, and they didn't have any kind of international for these products too. So they ended up like having, this kind of economic crisis, and relied or counted on rents and aids in order to balance the book, because they imported more than they exported. So this created, the balance of payment deficit, and they had to balance the book not through like increasing productivity or encouraging or stimulating investment, but through relying on foreign aid. We will talk about Egypt land reform measures and the institutions they created, and to what extent these organizational apparatuses, because they created economic organizations and industrial, the Ministry of Finance and National Planning and Industry, but these were, in addition to the political appointment, these were they didn't represent any kind of cohesive bureaucratic or organizational foundation for the developmental state. So here you have like, the share, here you have like the public and private shares in industrial investment. It started, they had like no share at all in 1959, in 1960, after the socialist transformation and the brutal nationalization and expropriation of private assets. One important thing also, like, the excessive, this is the trade balance in Egypt. So you see here, like, the difference between the exports and imports as well. It started there was like a huge gap, like from 1952 until 1970, and this is what we are going. This is the framework of our seminar discussion today. One last thing here, like, the excessive, military expenditure as well. So Egypt alone here, like you see, Egypt alone, like, exceeded, like, from 1958 until 1968, the military expenditure, it exceeded, the aggregate the expenditure on the military defense for Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. So it was like, misallocation or inefficient allocation of resources as well. So even the rents and the foreign aid they got, they used this for the military expenditure rather than like channeling or bumping these monies into productive economic productive sector or industrial sectors. Yeah, and this is like led eventually to the financial crisis, and this is like, we're going to discuss like Waterbury and Hennebusch and the other one on Syria. To what extent, these kind of contradictions of policy choices didn't enable, state to take roots or to emerge in the first place in the Middle East.